Hello, and welcome to this session on Tableau Server on Linux and how we've improved it since the initial 10.5 release. My name is Robert Brewer, and I'm an engineering manager at Tableau. I work at Tableau's Palo Alto office, but I didn't always live in Silicon Valley. I used to live in Honolulu, and this is how I looked going to work each day. Well, not really, but that would have been nice, wouldn't it? After living in Honolulu for 20 years, I decided it was time for a change, and so I moved to the mainland to work at Tableau. And at Tableau, I joined the team that brought Tableau Server to Linux. Our team has several decades of Linux expertise, and we are thrilled that customers now have the opportunity to deploy Tableau Server on Linux with all the power and flexibility that provides. If you're in this room, I know you're enthusiastic about Tableau Server on Linux. This was no quick and dirty port of our Windows product. Tableau Server on Linux is native Linux all the way down. We hope you enjoy all the geeky parts in Server as much as we enjoyed making them. Oh, there's my links. So Tableau has always prided itself on providing options to customers for what platform they want to work on. So you can use Windows, and now you can use Linux. But why might you want to use Linux? The first reason we provided Linux is because customers demanded it. Other reasons are that many organizations already have their server infrastructure running on Linux, and so it was easy to move server to Linux. It can also reduce your Windows licensing costs, both on-prem and in the public cloud. It's very important for some organizations. And of course, Linux tends to be easier to script and automate than Windows is. A little bit about this talk. It's an updated talk from one I gave last year at TC, and I'll cover how to set up server on Linux, while highlighting the improvements we've made since the initial release. Along the way, I'll cover the new Tableau Services Manager, or TSM, and talk about our security model on Linux. Some things I won't be talking about are how to upgrade from Windows to Linux, nor will I be doing a deep dive on TSM. There was a separate talk on Tuesday for that, and you can see it in the TC Live website if you want to check that out. So let's get started. First, I'm going to cover the releases of Tableau Server on Linux to date. So the first release was 10.5, and that was just the very initial version. Then came the 2018.1 release. The improvements there are something I like to call #sudoers0. If you're familiar with the 10.5 release, we had more complexity, and we need to use the sudo command, and that's all been removed in the 2018.1 and later releases. We made some other minor improvements, such as making it easier for you to set environment variables for TSM services, and also allow you to have a server-specific locale. So if you want to have your Linux OS in one locale and a server configured in a different locale, you can do that more easily. In the 2018.2 release, one of the main improvements was that we now support Amazon Linux 2. So it's very important for customers that are using AWS. It's just very easy to pick the very first choice in AMIs to use Amazon Linux 2 now. This was also the release when the TSM Web UI was made available on both Windows and Linux. And of course, this, while it's not a Linux improvement, server on Windows switched to TSM with the 2018.2 release. So now we have full parity on both platforms using TSM. In the 2018.3 release, the customer-facing improvements were more minor. We made it easier to configure a forward proxy with Initialized TSM, and we also now have command completion for tab command. Now, the 2019.1 beta that just got released on Tuesday, we have two new features, which I'll cover later. One is it's now possible to install the server packages outside of the OPT directory. And we also now avoid using SU for TSM via the TSM for authentication if you use the directory service on your system. So the agenda for my talk is that first I'll talk about how you can prepare yourself for Linux if you're currently running on Windows. Then the bulk of the talk is in the installation and initialization of Tableau Server. Then I'll get into upgrades, which work a little differently for Tableau Server than they do for other Linux packages. And then I'll have a section tidbits, just like a couple of slides about interesting features that didn't get covered elsewhere. I'll end with a recap, and should be plenty of time for Q&A. All right, preparing for Linux. The first thing most people want to know is what Linux distributions we support. So you can think of the Linux distributions as kind of a family tree. So up here at the top, you can think of this as Tux, the head of the Linux family tree. One major branch of the Linux family tree is Red Hat Enterprise Linux, also known as RHEL. We support RHEL version 7.3 and greater, but RHEL also has children. So CentOS is a child of RHEL, and we support version 7.3 of it as well. And Oracle Linux is another child, and so is Amazon Linux 2, which, as I mentioned, is a new in 2018.2 release. Another branch of the family tree starts with Debian, which we don't support right now, but we plan to support in the future. However, we do support a very popular child of Debian, which is Ubuntu, and we support the 16.04 release of Ubuntu. Now, for the rest of the talk, the parts of the branch of the family tree that on the left-hand side, I'll call the RHEL-like distros. And the branch on the right-hand side, I'll call the Debian-like distros. And then finally, we have SUSE, which is kind of not part of either of these branches. And we don't support that right now, but we plan to in the future. For resource requirements, they're generally the same as Windows. The key thing you need to know is that for CPU cores, we count actual cores. And this is true on Windows as well, but not hyperthreads. So most physical cores will have 2 hyperthreads. And the time this gets tricky is that some cloud platforms, such as AWS and Google Cloud Platform, call things size instances by vCPU. And when they talk about vCPU, what they mean really is hyperthreads. So if you get an instance that's 8 vCPU, that's actually half as big as you should have for a minimum recommended production instance. So you really want 16 vCPUs to equal 8 physical cores. Other resource requirements, we have 2 different directories that we use for Tableau Server. One is the installation directory, and all the binaries go there, and it takes up about roughly 3 gigabytes per version that's installed. Then we have the data directory, and that's where all your workbooks and extracts and so forth in the database go. And so you need a minimum of 50 gigabytes, but of course most customers will use much more than that. An interesting requirement that's a little bit unusual is that whatever account you use to administer TSM has to have a password assigned to it. And we'll talk about this more in the Tsm Authentication segment of the talk. The important thing to note here is that in many cloud platforms, you connect to the Linux server using a SSH public key. And in that case, your account may not have a password set at all, which will prevent you from authenticating to TSM. So in that case, it's easy to rectify. You need to set a password for that. And if you're using a local account, you can do that with the sudo password and then the username of the account that you need to set the password for. Now I'm going to briefly describe Tableau Services Manager. TSM is a client-server system for managing server. So now you can separate the management of server from Tableau Server itself. For example, you can think of the Tsm command that you use to talk to TSM. That's a REST client, and it communicates to a controller service endpoint. That's the controller. And then that controller takes actions on server, for example, starting or stopping server. So TSM is just this REST API, and we use the same public API for our clients that we expose to customers. So anything we can do with our tools, you can automate yourself. And just to mention that Linux is TSM only. It doesn't have any tabadmin. So just to reiterate, TSM and Tableau Server are actually separate entities. So TSM consists of these 5 services, and they run all the time on your system. So as soon as you've installed Tableau Server on the system, even before you've initialized server, you have the TSM services running. And they'll run whenever you have that server online. And then you can start and stop Tableau Server itself using TSM. But server is still independent of TSM in the sense that if you want to, like, say, upload a workbook, you do that by connecting to server and using server APIs. You don't use the TSM API for that kind of thing. So there's the 2 distinct entities. Some other differences for Windows admins. Installation, of course, is a major difference. We've already talked about TSM, though, of course, that changed with 2018.2 release. Data connectivity drivers. It's important to understand here that many drivers are available on Linux, but not necessarily all of them. So you should check our driver download page and just select Linux as the operating system. And in that case, it'll show you all the drivers that are available for Linux. And our connectivity team is working hard on continuing to add drivers for Linux. However, there are some cases where there are drivers that will never be supported on Linux just because the company that makes the software doesn't make a Linux driver. For example, there's no Linux driver for Microsoft Access, and we don't expect one to be delivered in the future. Upgrades work differently than you might be used to on Windows, and we'll talk about that in a whole section of the talk. Fonts are another little thing. If you're using Windows Server, you get certain fonts installed on your Windows Server by default, and your end users may be using those fonts in their workbooks. If you switch to Tableau Server on Linux, those fonts may not be available by default, and your workbooks may render differently. However, while there are some differences, many things remain the same. For example, configuration keys you're used to setting are still the same. Services like a backgrounder and BizQL Server, those are all the same. In terms of differences for your end users, we hope that the only difference will be that when they look at the About box for Tableau Server, they'll see that it's running on Linux. Now let's move on to installation. There are 3 phases to installing Tableau Server. First, you need to install the package, and we use native packages. Then you'll initialize TSM, and then you use TSM to initialize server. So first, we're going to talk about the package installation phase. We use distro native packages, as I said. On the RHEL-based distros, we use RPM. On the Debian-based distros, we use Deb. And our packages depend on other packages that are available in public repositories. So those will automatically be downloaded as part of the installation process. For RHEL-like distros, we use Yum to install packages. And for Debian-like distros, we use gdebi. We use gdebi and not the standard apt-get because gdebi is better. It downloads the dependent packages automatically for you in a way that apt-get does not when you're installing a local package. The server package layout, everything gets installed into opt Tableau Server, and that location is not configurable, though I'll talk about that in the next couple slides. All the files are owned by root and read-only, as you'd expect on a Linux system. In terms of layout, we have a manifest directory and a packages directory. In that packages subdirectory, you'll see an instance for every package on the server. Sorry, every service that's on part of Tableau Server. If you look closely at this slide, you'll see that there are side-by-side versions of these packages. So you see the Apache actually has 2 versions here. And that's not a typo. In Tableau Server on Linux, you install packages. You can have multiple side-by-side versions of Tableau Server, and that's very important in our upgrade process, which I'll talk about later. Now, as I mentioned, alluded to earlier, in the 2019.1 beta, we now allow you to install server anywhere you'd like. So you can install packages in arbitrary locations. The caveat here is that you have to install the package dependencies manually, and that's because the RPM command just doesn't do the automatic package dependency installation. So the only difference here is you use the RPM command and use this -- prefix command line flag, and then you pass any path you want there, and you can install your package anywhere you want on your system. It's very important for some enterprises that have requirements about where packages can be installed. And so if you want to install outside of opt, you can do it with this. And then once you've done that, everything else in the installation process works the same as usual. And another caveat is that this is only available in the RHEL-like distros. And unfortunately, that's just a limitation of the package format for Deb. We'll never be able to support it on Deb because they don't support this changing the prefix of the installation. Now, drivers, obviously, we have data connectivity drivers. Some of them are distributed, they're distributed separately from Tableau Server. Some come directly from Tableau, the ones that we're allowed to redistribute. Other ones you download directly from the vendor. The installation directory is opt Tableau driver. And the configuration file for most of them is etc odbc inst.ini. And the layout of the files, there's just one subdirectory for each driver. If you look here, we have a Postgres driver. And the thing to note here is that Tableau Server, the admin views in Tableau Server connect to the internal Postgres instance that's part of every Tableau Server. So if you want to view those admin views, you have to install the Postgres driver. Even if you don't use Postgres anywhere else in your organization, you need that driver in order to look at the admin views. So most admins excuse me, will want to install the Postgres driver, even if you don't use it in your organization. All right, so we covered installing packages. So now I'm going to give you a little bit of background about TSM before we get into how to initialize TSM. So if you're familiar at all with the 10.5 release we had in January, we had this a little complicated security model. We had a privileged user and an unprivileged user. And I'm happy to announce, as we transition to the 2018.1 and future releases, sudoers 0. So because of this change, which was prompted through feedback from customers like yourselves, we've been able to remove the privileged user and all the complexities of using sudo. And now the security model is much simpler. It looks like this. We have a single unprivileged user. By default, its name is Tableau. And it runs everything in Tableau Server. And we don't require sudo at all, except, of course, there are certain actions that require privilege, such as installing packages, initializing, and upgrading. But you provide the privilege yourself, either by typing in the commands yourself, running them as root using sudo or whatever means you want, or using your automation tool, such as Ansible or Puppet or Chef. And those tools, of course, run as root. So in that sense, you're executing things as root, but Tableau Server itself runs completely unprivileged. The files are owned by whatever the primary group is of the unprivileged user. And as a convenience, we add Tableau administrators to that same group just to make it easy for them to look at log files and so forth. But that's not required to run server at all. And I should mention that these user and group names are all completely configurable. And if you want, by default, we're using local users on the system. But you can use a user from directory service if you prefer. Now move on to Tsm Access Control. So TSM, the way Tsm Authentication works is we delegate the access control to the underlying operating system. So on Linux, we use the PAM, or Pluggable Authentication Modules, library, which is standard on every Linux distribution. So this means that we benefit from any configuration, PAM configuration you have on your server. So if you have a policy for auditing connections or throttling if people are trying to authenticate too quickly, all of that will apply to Tableau Server automatically. It also means that we will use whatever directory service is configured on the server. So if your Linux system is configured so that you can log in using your Active Directory credentials, then of course you can log into TSM using those same credentials because we just delegate to the operating system. As I mentioned earlier, authentication is done always with username and password. Under the covers, we're using the SU command in some cases to verify those credentials. And generally, it just works however you have the PAM configured. So if it works, if you can SSH into the system, then you can use that same account to log into TSM. However, in order to authorize which users in your directory service or otherwise are able to use TSM, we have the TSM authorized group. So if you're a member of that group, then we let you administer Tableau Server. By default, that group name is TSM admin. However, just like everything else, you can configure that. So here's an overview of the users and groups we use in Tableau Server on Linux. There's one user, the unprivileged user, which runs everything. And it usually, by default, its name is Tableau. We have two groups. There's the group that just is used by the unprivileged user, which defaults to being Tableau. And we also have the TSM authorized group, which provides TSM access. And by default, its name is TSM admin. All right, with that background, we can talk about initializing TSM. So the first question you might have is, why do we have to do a separate step to initialize TSM anyway? I just installed the package. And the answer is that package installation doesn't provide as a way to give configuration parameters to the package, to Tableau Server. For example, you might want to choose which data directory, which path on your system to use as a data directory. And we can't provide that at package installation time. So we separate this configuration part into a separate step, which we call Initialize TSM. It's just a bash script that you run as root. There's lots of configuration options, which I'm not going to list out here. However, the defaults work for many customers. So rather than talking more about initializing TSM, let's do it. Give me a second here. And switch into, why is it over there? That's not what I intended, but that'll work. OK. So this will be a little bit more challenging than last time. So then I've just installed the package. And the first thing I'm going to do is run the command that it tells me to run there in the output. So I'm going to type sudo opt tableau. Oops. OK, let me play with my display here for a second. Oh, right. I'm sorry? Yeah, it's just a little harder for me to see around the corner.
Oh, okay. You typed an L.
Oh, that's what it was. OK. Now I just need to swap the displays here. This worked perfectly the first time we gave this talk.
Swap displays at the top of the room and get
That one?
Yeah, that one.
All right. Yeah, I know what I did wrong. I pressed this. Yay, OK. That's what I wanted. Sorry about that. So we'll run opt tableau, tableau, tableau server. We want the packages subdirectory scripts, and we're running the script to initialize TSM. We're going to use the one required parameter, which is you have to accept our end user license agreement. So you type accept EULA. So you can read off what's going on here. It's creating the TSM admin group. It's creating the TSM unprivileged user account. It creates the directories and the data directory. It's adding my user, which I logged into the system, which is CentOS, to those various groups. It's checking the fact that I have less than 50 gigabytes of disk space, which is fine for this demo, but it will warn you if you do that. And now it's starting the TSM services. And I'll take a moment.
This could be run like in silent mode, right?
I'm sorry?
Can it be run in silent mode, like behind the scenes?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, this is totally scriptable.
Okay, cool.
In fact, I'll cover that later in the talk.
Okay, sorry to jump in.
Oh, no, not at all. We got some time. It takes another 30 seconds. OK, there we go. So now we've successfully installed the TSM services. So note, this isn't Tableau Server that's been installed. Just the TSM services are running now. And we can look behind the covers here. We can actually see how we run Tableau Server, the TSM services. And what we do is we use systemd, which is the standard for running services on Tableau Server, on Linux, as the user as a systemd user service. And I'm going to log into the account, which we've used for the unprivileged user. And now if I type systemctl -- user status, we get a list of all the services that are running. And we can see that we have the client file service, tab admin, controller. Actually, let's do this. To get more detailed status here. So we can see all the TSM services are running normally. Now, normally, as a customer, you would generally not have to do this. We handle all this management for you. This is just sort of show you how we run these services. And these services will typically run all the time. Now that we've done initialized TSM, they're sort of permanently running. And you use them to administer server. So I'm going to get out of this shell and switch back to the presentation. So we've initialized TSM. Let me switch back to presentation mode. All right. So another important thing to know about initialized TSM is that it's a one-time operation. So you should only run initialized TSM once. It's only needed the first time, and it's not part of upgrading to a new version, so you should never, ever run it ever again. Most options can't be changed after initialization. So for example, the user and group names, if you want to use once. Oh. Yeah.
When TSM gets an upgrade at 7, what do you do?
Oh, I'll cover that in the upgrade section. Definitely, yeah. Basically, just to realize that there's a separate command we use for upgrading. Initialized TSM is only used in the very first time you're installing a TSM on a server. Thank you for that clarification. Also, the data directory path is something that you can't change after you've installed the server. Of course, as a Linux admin, there are other ways you can change where your files get stored by mounting another directory there, or mounting another file system there, or whatnot. But the path itself doesn't change after you've initialized. All right, so now we've covered initializing TSM. Let's move on to initializing server. And the way you do that is by talking to TSM. And this great feature we have in 2018.2 is that we have a web UI. And it's beautiful, and I'm not going to talk anything about that because there was a whole other talk that was excellent. So I'm going to move right on to the TSM the TSM Command-Line Interface. And it is unsurprisingly called TSM. It's just a REST API client. And if you use it, when you use it, it will prompt you for your username and password before connecting to the controller endpoint. And all the communication between the client and the server is secured using TLS. It has a bunch of different commands. You can see the whole list with TSM help commands. It has all of your favorites like backup and restore. And note that we have so many commands now that we've organized them into categories and subcategories. For example, in the authentication section, we have a subcategory of Kerberos, and under that, you have various commands like configure, enable, and disable. All right, so now that we've talked about it, let's initialize Tableau Server. Let's do it the right way this time. All right, so what we're going to do is, so I'm going to type TSM status -v to show the verbose status. And, oh, interesting. It prompts me for my password. It's logging in by default using my username. And it shows me that the 5 services that are part of TSM are running, but it says the status of server is stopped because Tableau Server itself is not running. So the next thing we need to do is we need to activate a license. So that's licenses. And I should note that we do tab command completion here. So if you forget what the parameters to licenses are, you can hit tab, and it'll show you a list of those. So in this case, I want to use activate. And let's say I hit tab again. These are the different command parameters I can use for activate. Let's say I forget what these different parameters mean. It's convenient to just type h-h like that, and you get the help just for that command right at that point. And I can see that -t is what I want for a trial. So just for the purpose of this demo, I'm going to activate a trial license. But you could just easily type -k and enter your license key there. All right, so we activated a trial license. The next step is we need to register Tableau Server. And to do that, we, from the command line, you provide a JSON configuration file. And I have one right here, registration.json. And it's fairly straightforward. It just has different fields for you expect to find a registration. You can fill that out with your favorite text editor. I have one that's pre-set up here. So I will do tsm register -- file registration.json. It'll read that in. Registration is now complete. So now we're going to configure Tableau Server. Tableau Server has defaults for every single configuration parameter except for one, and that's the identity store. So how you store users in Tableau Server, that doesn't have a default. And the reason for that is that you can't change that after you've set it. So we want people to make a very informed decision about what kind of identity store they want to use for their server. In the case of this demo, I'm going to use a local identity store. So I'm going to use the most simple configuration file possible in this config.json file. All it does is set the identity store to type local. Now, of course, you can have much more complicated configuration files. So here's like a big configuration.json, which is using LDAP as a directory service. It's binding, it's setting user, it's defining which types of fields in your LDAP map to which things in Tableau Server. So there's a lot of complexity you can have here. And the fact that you have it in this config.json file means it's very repeatable. Once you got a configuration that you like, you can bring up a new server and import the configuration. You can also export configuration. So what I'm going to do is import this simple configuration with tsm settings import -f config.json. That'll take a moment. In TSM, you can think of configuration settings as kind of like a shopping cart. So what you do is you make a bunch of configuration changes together, and then when you're ready, you apply them all at once in an atomic operation. So that means that you can make sure that all your configuration settings take effect at once. And so you can see what pending changes you have with a tsm pending changes command. You say pending changes list. This will show us a list of all the configuration changes we've made. And in our case, there's just one thing, which is the authentication set to local. Now we'll go to tsm pending changes, and now we're ready to apply these changes to our server configuration. Now this command runs as an asynchronous job, so it's running in the background on the server, because if you had a multi-node cluster, you would need to push out the configuration to every node in the cluster and to every service on those nodes, and that can take a little bit of time. In this case, we have a single node, so it'll only take a moment. All right, so we've applied that configuration, and now we can move on to the last step, which is Tsm Initialize. And I'm going to use the start server flag to start up server after initialization. And I'll hit return here. This is another asynchronous job, and this one takes about 15 minutes to install. But like any good cooking show, I'm going to pull out of the oven a completely finished server. It's been fully initialized. We can move on. So I'm going to close this window, and I'm going to switch to Firefox. So here's a glance at the TSM web UI. This is the default status page, which shows you all the processes that are running on the server, and that they're all nice and happy. I'm going to switch to a different tab, and this is like loading the server itself. And I'm going to hit reload here. And here we are. It's telling me that Tableau Server is not completely set up. And that is true because while we've initialized server, we haven't set the initial admin for Tableau Server. So what we're going to do is go back to our command shell here. And I'm going to set up the initial user. And note that since Tableau Server has now been fully initialized, TSM is kind of out of the picture. We're going to use tab command to set up the initial user because this is something that happens in Tableau Server, not TSM. Again, there's two sides of it. There's TSM, Tableau Server. Tab command is what talks to server. So I'm going to type in tab command. And now in 2018.3, we have tab completion for, for tab command. Initial user. The server is localhost. The user is admin. And I'm going to load my password from a file. All right, so now that's configured. Now if I hit reload here, I will get the login page. Maybe a little smaller. And in a moment, we will see Tableau Server. Oh, yeah, I already had the Superstore loaded, so there we are, rendering business on our freshly installed server. Okay, switch back to PowerPoint here. And yeah, sure.
Everyone keeps saying 2018.3. I thought I heard it mentioned, and everyone's using it. Is that only available online right now, or?
Yeah, 2018.3 is going to be available very soon.
Okay.
Yeah, it's just basically we've been sort of like talking about like for our demos and so forth, preparing for TC, but it'll be available in your hands very soon.
Because I was looking for this.
Yes, yeah. Okay, so now we've initialized server and we have a running server. Another thing I want to talk about is adding worker nodes. So the first thing is that with TSM, we don't have worker nodes and master nodes. There's no distinction between the nodes. There's an initial node, and that initial node will get the TSM controller installed on it. And then you have the additional nodes. And you use the same install package for all nodes. There's not like a special worker installer that you use on the other nodes. Note that controller, there can only be one controller that runs at a time on a cluster right now, but you can move the controller from node to node. So if you have a failure on the node that has the controller running, there's a script you can run on a different node, and you'll pull up a controller on that node. When the TSM controller is down, you can't do actions like backup and restore, but your server itself, rendering vises and extract refreshes, all of that continues because, again, that would be a failure in TSM, but not a failure in Tableau Server. The way you install on a different node is you get this bootstrap file, which you obtain using a TSM command listed here. And you grab that file on the controller node, and then you copy it over to your new additional node. And then you load that file, you pass that file to initialize TSM. All right, so now we've covered the 3 steps for setting up server on Linux, but wouldn't it be wouldn't it be nice if there were an easier way to do that? And the answer is yes, there is. It's called the automated installer, in answer to your question earlier. So what is the automated installer? It's a bash script, and all it does is it installs the package, it initializes TSM, and initializes server. It's fully customizable because it's a bash script. You can edit it any way you want. It has a wide variety of parameters. It has all the parameters of initialized TSM. It has additional parameters letting you set the configuration file, the license key you want to use, and so forth. It's designed for fully unattended operation, so you can provide any passwords you need in your secrets file. And I should note that Tableau uses it extensively internally for testing, so it's something that we use and depend on it inside Tableau. I've listed an example invocation down below. I'm not going to walk through every command part of the parameter, but basically you run this one command and then you wait 15 minutes or so and then you have a running server.
Quick question.
Yeah.
We took the cloud formation template from Git, which uses this, right? And reworked it to use a modern image
Okay.
with our corporate security stuff on it. Is there anything that we need to think about going forward? Like, would there be a point where that might break, you know, with a future release that we'll have to revisit the...
Right, so I'll cover that in the very next slide, I think. So one thing is that how do you get Tableau Server, the automated installer? And the answer is it's kind of a chicken and egg problem because the automated installer installs the package itself, so you can't put the automated installer inside the package because how would you use it to install? So what we do is we install it as a separate package. And you can find it on GitHub. It's community supported, so we put it out there, but we don't provide the same level of support as we do for Tableau Server itself. You install the package using yum or gdebi. And the key thing is it's versioned alongside server. So basically, whenever you have a new release of Tableau Server, there's a new release of the automated installer because there can be changes to server which need to be applied to the automated installer. Does that answer your question? So basically, if you have forked it, essentially, you'll need to keep up with the updates to the automated installer in the case we've made a change. Usually there are additions, like if we add a new flag to initialize TSM, we have to have that flag in automated installer to pass it through to initialize TSM.
And the actual script is referenced though, right? It's not, so cloud formation points to the online script, is that right?
No, you download the script. Yeah, you basically, if there's a package form. We also provide it in script form if you want to just, if you want to fork it, for example, on GitHub. But if you want to install as a package, we have package, deb and RPM files on the server.
Who gets to update that automated script install? Is it you guys or
Yes, so basically we update it with each release. Yeah.
nobody else?
Well, you can submit, it's on GitHub, so you can submit pull requests. If you have improvements you'd like to make or you find a bug, we're happy to hear about that. But basically, we will make sure that there's a new version that goes along with each version of Tableau Server. Okay, so when might you not want to use the automated installer? The one thing is the first time you're doing an installation, you probably don't want to use it because it's a lot easier to correct any issues you bump into when you're doing things manually because you run into a problem, you can go fix that problem, and then you can come back and just go on to the next step. If you're doing anything that requires parameter validation, for example, when you're setting up authentication, your AD binding, sometimes that can take a little bit of trial and error to figure out what exactly parameters you need for your directory service. And we provide tools within the TSM CLI that let you verify the mapping of parameters. And so that's a lot easier to do manually. And once you got it down in your configuration file, then you can use the automated installer. Also, if you need to, that feature I mentioned, the 2019.1 beta about installing outside of opt, we don't support that with the automated installer. We figure if you're doing that, then you know how to roll your own automation. Now let's move on to upgrades. So the first thing to know about upgrades is that we kind of violate Linux packaging norms. If you're familiar with Linux, you know that typically the way you update a package is you say sudo yum update and then the name of the package. The problem for us is that a server upgrade requires more care than upgrading your audio player or something like that on your Linux system. So the way we handle this is the Tableau Server package names include the version as part of the name of the package. So as an example here I have the 2018.1.4 and 2018.2.0 releases. And if you look at the name of the package, it actually has that string embedded in the name of the package. That's very important for our upgrading paradigm. So the way you upgrade Tableau Server on Linux is you always install a new package. You're never actually updating an old package. I'll cover this in more detail. So here's our upgrade paradigm. You always install the new package version, and all of our installation bits are versioned, so they install side by side, never conflicting with anything that's already installed. And they'll live side by side, as I said. And the other great thing about this is that installing a new package is harmless. You could go on your production server, install a new version of the package, and it won't touch that production server in any way. So it's completely safe. Note that on a cluster, you are in charge of installing the package on each of the nodes, which is different from classic tab admin, where that would happen automatically. We figure for most customers, you're going to be using some sort of automation system anyway, which knows how to install packages, so you can just use that to push out the package to each of your Linux servers. Then, when you're ready to take downtime, you update the data directory to the new version using the upgrade TSM script. So this is what you use, not initialize TSM, upgrade TSM. And you run that script on the controller node, and it takes care of upgrading the data directory to the new version. Then, when you're ready to reclaim some disk space, you can delete that existing package, and all it does is clean up some disk space. It's not going to change anything running on the server, assuming you're not deleting the package that's actually running. So the corollary to this is that you never need to upgrade a package. You could type sudo yum update and then the name of your package, but it's always going to tell you there's nothing that needs updating. So you just don't need to use the update command with Tableau Server. So here's a little bit of a more in-depth example of upgrading from 2018.1.4 to 2018.2. So we have the running version, which I won't read the whole version string there. You install that new package version using sudo yum install. You can use this whenever you want because it doesn't incur any downtime. Then you back up your server because you're a prudent admin. Then you upgrade the data directory to the new version, and that in start server. So you run the sudo upgrade Tsm command. You have to accept the end user license agreement. You also have to pass a username for the Tsm admin because you're going to have to authenticate in order to prove that you're allowed to upgrade server. And make sure your server's running OK. And then sometime in the future, when you're ready, you can just remove that old package with sudo yum erase in the package name. So some things to not do when you're upgrading is don't uninstall the running version. That's bad. If you do, however, there is a recovery path. So if you accidentally uninstall the version that you're actually running on your server, you just reinstall that same package. And this is the one time that you run initialize TSM a second time. So if you run initialize TSM on a server that already has a data directory and everything's set up, then it will notice that, it will see that and go, oh, all you want to do is really just restart the services and use your existing data, and then you'll be back to running. Other thing you want to do is don't run initialize TSM from the new version. You might be tempted to do that. Always stick with upgrade TSM. And always run the upgrade TSM from the new version, not the old version, because the new version knows about the future. It knows how to do things for the new version, whereas the old version of upgrade TSM doesn't know about that. So here it is in pictorial form. The life cycle of server is you install the package for the very first time, you initialize TSM, you initialize server, and then sometime in the future, Tableau releases a cool new version with features that you want. You install the new package. Then you run the upgrade TSM script. And then at some point in the future, when you want to reclaim some disk space, you uninstall the old package. All right, so that's upgrades. Now let's talk about a couple tidbits that didn't fit in elsewhere. The first of those is the obliterate script. So sometimes on a server, you really want to start from scratch. You want to, and the obliterate script will let you do that. So it will remove almost all traces of Tableau Server. Note this will delete all of your workbooks, all of your extracts, all of your users. So this is something you would only use very infrequently. It will also remove the server packages. So it's not something you use very often, but sometimes you have, say you have a test VM and you installed a beta release and you want to try out some other version, then you always want to use obliterate and not just remove the package, because obliterate will make sure we remove all the traces of Tableau Server, and so you won't get confused with a second installation. The script is called Tableau Server Obliterate. It lives in the scripts directory right alongside initialize TSM. And say you accidentally forgot and you uninstalled the package and you really wanted to obliterate it, but you just removed the package first. We stash a copy of Tableau Server Obliterate in the var temp directory in case you forgot. All right, so obliterating server is kind of fun, so I'm just going to jump in and obliterate one of these servers I just set up. So let me switch to slideshow. All right, so here we have our happily running server. I can run status here, and so there, let's see the server's running, and now we're going to kill server. So we run opt, Tableau Server, packages, scripts, Tableau Server obliterate. I'll run that, and it goes, oh, wait. You want to be really, really sure that you want to obliterate server. So you have to use the -y flag 3 times when you run Tableau Server obliterate, because we want to be really, really sure you're going to blow away all of your data. dash y, dash y, dash y. So it's deleting the users we created, it's deleting the packages, it's deleted the data directory, and now Tableau Server is obliterated. And now if I type tsm status, it'll say, what's tsm? I don't know anything about tsm command. Tableau Server is completely gone from your server now. All right, let's move back to the slides. A couple other things. We now, in the 2018.1 release, we write, all the installation scripts write logs to the var temp directory. And this is useful sometimes for debugging. Most customers won't need to use it, but sometimes we have some customer that has a very strange, an environment we haven't seen before. And if there's some problem with one of our scripts, it's nice to have a log that shows exactly which line of the script the script failed on and what happened. And so we write these logs there automatically. They're not picked up by zip logs because you wouldn't need them except when you're doing an installation. So they're only used for debugging purposes. We also now support configuring a forward proxy as part of initialization in the 2018.3 release. So if you want to use an outbound proxy for all of your traffic, you can just add these two parameters to initialize TSM. You set the proxy, HTTP proxy, and you can have a separate proxy for HTTPS connections, and you just add those parameters to initialize TSM, and then all of your processes will use the forward proxy. Also, I mentioned earlier, you can set environment variables. In the 2018.1 release, we make that a lot easier. So sometimes you want to change the environment for all your TSM processes. For example, some drivers expect to have certain environment variables set for your all your processes. And since the processes run via systemd, some of the standard ways in Linux that you use to set environment variables don't work. So we make it very easy now. There's a special directory which lives in the home directory of your unprivileged user. By default, that's just the data directory. And if you drop a file in this Tableau Server _server.conf.d, then you will and then restart the TSM services, then all the TSM services will have any environment variables that you set in that file. We also, as I mentioned before, you can set the locale for server as separate from your Linux system OS. So say you live in Quebec and your locale is set to French Canadian, but for some reason you want to have Tableau Server be in the English US locale. All you have to do is set that locale in the environment variable lang before you initialize TSM. And when you run initialize TSM, we'll notice that the locales don't match, and we'll make sure that you want to do that, and then we'll set up Tableau Server with that locale. And the nice thing about this is that it uses that environment variable directory I mentioned in the previous slide. All we're doing is creating a little file, 10-lag.conf, and it has the one parameter there, which is the environment variable to set the locale. All right. In closing, I want to recap. So we started by talking about how to prepare for Linux. In particular, we talked about the fact that vCPUs are almost always hyperthreads, and so you need to be careful of that when you're looking at sizing your instance properly for a Tableau Server. Let me skip back here. We also talked a lot about initialization, installation, and initialization, how there are three major steps, which is installing the package, initializing TSM, and then initializing server. We also talked about upgrades and the fact that they are different than they work differently than they do on Linux in general, and that we have side-by-side versions, so you can install two versions of Tableau Server side-by-side. And then finally, we talked about some little tidbits like obliterating your server with Tableau Server Obliterate. We have multiple related sessions, but these are the only ones that are probably relevant to us right now. If you're interested in providing feedback on our server documentation, we love to have that, and we have a member of our server documentation team in the back, Mary. So if you're interested in providing feedback on our documentation, we'd love to hear that. And also, as I mentioned, there was another talk about TSM earlier at TC, but that means that it'll be available on the TC Live website once the presentations are put up. I'd also ask that you can complete the survey in the app. We really enjoy having data about how we do on these presentations, and it'll help me to improve presentations for the future. So, if you're ready for more, If you haven't tried Server on Linux yet, you can download a trial from our website. If you have tried Tableau Server on Linux and you want to know more, you can check out our betas. You can do that going to tableau.com/getbeta, and you can download the 2019.1 beta right now. And with that, I'll stop and ask for questions. Oh, actually, can I get the mic? Sorry, just so we're recording this.
Thank you. Hello. What happened with the support for ODBC drivers for another databases like Netissa? Because I download the Netissa driver for install, and Tableau don't respond for get data in Tableau Server.
So I'm not familiar specifically with the Netissa connector. Did you look on the driver download page? Do we have support?
Yes.
Okay. So
yes, at this time, Tableau Server on Linux don't support for ODBC for Netissa, and I try with ODBC generic configure, but we have a issue when try connect to access to data on Netissa at this moment.
Okay.
In the next release, the ODBC support exists to Netissa or no?
I'm not sure. I'm actually data connectivity happens in a completely different team from mine, and so I'd have to check with them. I know we talked a little bit earlier at my previous talk. Have you opened a support case on this?
Yes, I put a support case,
Okay.
but don't respond because only it told me that the Tableau Server don't support for Netissa ODBC, but I configured the generic ODBC.
I see.
I try the ODBC from Netissa IBM Netissa site, download and try configure the ODBC, but don't respond at this moment too.
Yeah, I'm afraid I'm not sure how to solve that. If you've opened a support case and we said we don't support it yet, then I guess at this point we don't support that configuration. So I don't have any immediate relief for you. I don't know anything about a future release that would support that.
Okay, maybe you have a card.
Yeah, we can talk
provide
after.
you? Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Hi.
Do you mind going back to the do's and don'ts of
Sure.
upgrades?
Absolutely. There you go.
Thank
That
you.
one. I should also mention that all these slides will be posted on the TC Live website in the future.
Hello. When we are migrating from Windows Server, are we doing pretty much everything what you showed in installation?
Yes. The typical way people migrate from Windows to Linux is they take a backup on their Windows server. They just copy that backup file over to their Linux server. You do the initialization as I talked here, and then when you're done, you just restore your Windows backup, and that works.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Oh, I think there's somebody. We'll get to you next. Yeah.
So a quick question. We're trying to make the decision between Windows and Linux. I guess what are the two main advantages over Windows?
So I'd say the most important thing is like what your organization is comfortable with. So
They're comfortable with both.
okay. So a big thing is licensing costs. People, especially people who are using the public cloud like AWS, you can just look at the prices, and the Linux prices, Windows prices can be like 40% more than a Linux instance, especially if you're using like something like CentOS or something like that that's free. So for some companies, that's a big thing. Just being able to see your price per hour go down by that is important. If you're an organization that uses a lot of Linux, then you probably have a lot of automation. And most admins find that while you can automate Windows, Linux is just, since it's so textual and oriented towards scripting, it's just much easier just to automate things and have them sort of come up completely fresh. Like if you want to start up a whole new cluster, we definitely have customers that have integrated into their own automation systems, and they can now just like push a button and have a whole new Tableau cluster set up exactly the way they want it. Sorry, you had a comment?
Yeah, for Windows to Linux. So one of the issues which we faced when we were doing the 10.
Can you hold the mic a little bit closer?
Yeah,
Thank you.
one of the issues which we faced when we are moving 10.5 to Linux. Tab CMD, you have to upgrade your Windows also to Tab TSM. If not, that gives you a real huge problems when you are doing the backup, restore, and everything from both ends of the site. So I don't.
It's certainly possible to upgrade from 10.5 directly, Windows directly to any version of Linux. We do that all the time in our test environment. So it is possible that there could be some sort of issue in your particular environment, which, but I'm saying as a rule, it is possible to do those kinds of upgrades. Now going backwards, if you want to go from Linux TSM back to a version of Tableau Server on Windows before we ship TSM, that is to say like 10.5, that requires a lot more work. You have to do actual surgery on the backup file. But going forward, it should work. Someone in the front row had a question here.
My voice is loud, sorry. How frequently, on average, is there an update release for Linux as opposed to Windows? Are they typically in the same
They're exactly
cadence?
they're the exact same cadence.
What is that typically?
As a company, I think it's quarterly, though it's not exactly on the quarter necessarily. But,
okay. From that, is there any plan to decouple your custom Apache Tomcat, so that it can be upgraded separately, like more quickly,
right,
instead of having to wait for a quarterly release?
Right. So I should mention that we have quarterly releases for the main, for feature releases, but we have maintenance releases every month.
So the maintenance releases.
Right. So if there's a security patch, for example, for Apache, then that will be in the very next maintenance release in a month. We have had customers have asked, like we do use some standardized components like Apache, as you mentioned, and they're curious about whether they could like swap out that component and use something else from their existing infrastructure. Right now, that's not possible. We do have on the roadmap certain services, like for example, maybe being able to use a different Postgres repository instead of using the one that we ship. But I'm not sure we have something for Apache right now. One thing an issue for us is that there can be tight integration. And so if you're using even a little bit different version of Apache than the one we test with, then it's harder for us to say, okay, Tableau Server works as a whole. If there's a problem you hit and you're using your own special different version of Apache, then we're like, oh, okay, is the problem in that change, or is it Tableau Server itself? So it's something that we're definitely looking at, but we don't have any plans for it immediately.
And the last thing we're interested in is finding out if there are other customers in the government space that are using Linux, the Linux deployment in AWS. And so maybe we could talk afterwards,
Yeah,
find out who
good.
to talk to about that.
Okay.
Thanks.
Maybe we'll have him first.
Just wanted to check if the Tableau Server classroom training and certification now includes Linux and TSM in the syllabus?
That's a very good question. I know that certainly they're working on that because Linus Wilson, who gave a hands-on training at TC, gives a Linux with Linus training, and that of course is Linux-based. I'm not sure about the certification. Obviously, we're definitely going to go that way because right now everything is TSM now that we've shipped it on Windows as well. You had another question?
Okay.
Hi.
Again, wait. What is your recommendation for scale upgrades and backups for in Linux on Tableau Server? What's your recommendation for scale and automatic?
In terms of backups, they work the same on Windows and Linux now. So and the backup file we create is the same as we do on tab command. It's basically just a giant zip file that has your extracts and your backup of your database and your configuration files. Mm-hmm. So in terms of recommendation, that's really something that your organization, like basically you should back up Tableau servers as frequently as you back up your other things like a mail server or your database server and so forth.
Can I schedule with cron tab?
Yes. Yes, you can schedule them with the cron job.
With a shell script?
Yep, exactly. Yeah, you can just run that TSM command.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Any other questions? All right, well, thank you very much.